The year is 2016. Since quite a young age, I had an interest in programming. I spent much of my time since about the age of 12 developing very small and stupid games. Most of these were not much to look at, but I loved making them. But in school, working towards completing my exams and heading off to university to study computer science, I realised time was moving on for me. I was no longer just some child in his room developing games. I was now 18, legally an adult. I could drive. This was bad. So I decided to myself I needed to officially start work on my masterpiece. This would be the thing that wrote my name into the ages, but it would have to be better than anything I had made before. So I decided I would not only devote myself to this game, but I would spend 10 years on it. The game itself would be an RPG style game set from a slightly tilted camera perspective, like games such as Mario 3D World. It was set in a fantasy world and involved exploration, collectibles, finding new things, and generally having a good time. But my previous games had been pretty simple, and there was no real artistic flair to them. They were technically uninteresting. I wanted to build something that could be technically complicated to match my aspirations, so settled on 3D, where I had mostly been making 2D projects before. I decided that the best way to get good at something was just to do it, and once my exams were over, I would devote myself completely to this game. The time rolled around and I was eager to get started, now free of school. One problem though, starting on a project involving something which you know nothing about is difficult, and I struggled to figure out how to begin. A major rule I had set for myself was that I wanted to keep everything about the game free, as in freedom and open source. That meant no using Unity or anything else like that. You may think this was a strange choice, and maybe it was, but I had always been a technically driven person. I had always written my games from scratch, and having full control of the source code to me was a must. This was generally unconventional at the time, and even less so these days, but I love the technicals, so went with that. And in case you're wondering why I didn't use any open source engine like Godot, this is what they looked like at the time. Even with its rapid advancement, it still isn't really where I need it to be, at least for my requirements. Anyway, my first step was learning as much as I could about OpenGL. I built a simple rendering framework, learned all the concepts and put them into practice as much as I could. I also had to learn C++, as previously I'd made my games in either Java or JavaScript. This was actually pretty time consuming, as I was hoping that the language would be similar to Java. Progress was slow, and this took me a few months, and by the time I was familiar with these concepts, I was already moving into my first year at university. Gradually, I was learning more and my tech demos were becoming more interesting, but eventually I hit my first wall. Graphics is hard. Harder than you might think actually, or at least harder than I thought it would be. There are no built-in material properties, no real lighting code, and turns out cameras don't really exist. If you want to do anything with graphics, you need to know a mind-numbing amount of starter maths just to get something mildly interesting. And if you actually want to be performant and push the boundaries, you have to optimize it past the point of sanity. And just when you think OpenGL is hard enough, turns out there's more than one rendering API. Where the rendering API, like OpenGL, lets you tell the GPU what to do, the game engine needs to provide a platform-agnostic way to let the developer not have to think about all the deeply technical stuff. Unfortunately though, the industry is moving towards a future where if you wanted to have multi-platform support, you had to support multiple rendering APIs. With its roots running back to the 90s, OpenGL has historically been the bridge between all platforms, and also, generally, the easiest to use. Apple's decision to abandon it in favour of their own API, called Metal, meant that OpenGL was sort of dead in the water. As well as this, Kronos, the group that manages OpenGL, were working on a more modern replacement for it, called Vulkan. Also, generally, it's best practice to use DirectX on Windows platforms as well, if you can, although it does support all the other two. This meant that if you wanted to support all three major desktop operating systems, you had to support roughly 3 APIs as well. If all that sounded bad, this was the time I was gradually coming to terms with what an enormous job this would all be. With graphics, not only do you have to deal with rendering, but also loading resources, batching, occlusion culling, lighting, and realistically, if you want to be respected, scene trees, global illumination, transparency, and others. Even with my plan of 10 years, I couldn't realistically fit within that time schedule while also having to do all this myself. However, one thing I eventually realised was that I could meet my initial requirements without having to concern myself with any of this. My stubborn requirement was that I would have full access and control of my source code, and turns out I could achieve that without having to write any of my own rendering engine. It was around this time I decided I would switch to using Ogre 3D for my game. You're quite likely unaware of what Ogre is, but before out-of-the-box engines like Unity existed, Ogre was a popular industry option for game developers. Used by games such as Torchlight and Hob, it is explicitly just a rendering engine, containing no physics, sound, input, scene editing, and any other things you would expect from a full game engine. This was great for me because it would solve my issue of multi-platform support, while also being featureless enough that I could design the rest of my engine myself. It is a fully free and open source project, meaning I wouldn't have to abandon my initial challenge for my game by using it. With this decision made, I spent a good deal of time trying to get Ogre up and running. This was slower than I expected it to be, however. I was still very new to C++, and things like building code to libraries was something I had little experience at. This is probably a good time to point out that Ogre is a massive and very historic code base, maintained only by a few volunteers, meaning documentation is sparse and spread between forum posts. If you think I was taking the easy route going with Ogre, well I was, but it's still not that easy. These days, with out-of-the-box engines existing, the niche it fills is developers with some experience in code, mostly for things like simulation rather than games. It's harder to pick it up as a novice, which is sort of what I did. I eventually managed to get it working, but take my word for it when I say it took me a month of trying. Everything was just so new to me. However, I sort of enjoyed it. I didn't even think my experience with Bare OpenGL was a waste of time, as I was able to approach concepts with more of an understanding. From this baptism by fire, I learned loads about C++ and Ogre's chosen build system, CMake, things which I wouldn't have learned otherwise. The year is now 2017. I was approaching the end of my first year at university, and I felt I was getting good enough at C++ and Ogre to take on my first real project. I decided I would try my hand at building something I needed anyway, a level editor. I decided to name it Rockpool and got to work on it immediately. I'll just warn you in advance, this was a complete disaster project. Unfortunately, this project was not thought out as well as it should have been. I spent much of my summer break on it, taking about 4 to 5 months in total. I did get better at Ogre and C++, but mostly because it showed me that I wasn't actually as great with that stuff as I thought I was. Really, it was a mess. I had no idea what the requirements for the game actually were, and was just coming up with vague ideas as I went. The code was not planned out and contained lots of atrocities, and gradually became more and more unmaintainable. I chose to build a level editor because I felt that I wasn't ready to start on the actual game yet, but in doing so I created a tool for a project that didn't exist. I felt that if I just worked harder on it, I would break through that barrier, but that's also called the sunk cost fallacy. The final straw was soon after I moved into my accommodation for second year university. There are actually 2 versions of Ogre, Ogre and Ogre Next, although at the time that was still called Ogre 2. Ogre, being as old of a project as it is, the original version had some really legacy code support and generally crusty code base. Some of the members of the community decided to get together and plan out a complete rethink of Ogre, with a mind for where the future of graphics was going to be. The problem was that Rockpool was built around enough old features that supporting Ogre 2.1 would pretty much be impossible without a rewrite. The game would use Ogre 2.1, and thus it became obvious that I needed to let Rockpool die. Or at least hibernate it for a while. Yeah, it's dead. Mistakes are worth making, just as long as you don't make them again. Keeping a note of my previous failures and going forward, there was a strange feeling that a weight had lifted from my shoulders. I was aware that I had wasted a huge deal of time, but I also felt like it was all part of the process. I had learned lots about C++ and writing user interfaces and editor tools. Remember, I was having to learn all this stuff as I went. But I did decide that I needed to rethink my approach to the project. I had to go from the perspective of the game first. So I started to fill in any of the other gaps in my knowledge I had about the project, beyond just graphics. I thought through level design problems, decided what my procedure for chunking and map loading would be, and generally came up with a list of things I would need to know. I systematically went through all these things and learned what I could about them. I started fresh with Ogre 2.1 and began writing small samples. I built demos with built-up physics. I started using the programming language Squirrel as my embedded scripting language. I wrote my own entity component system to understand how they worked, although that didn't go very well. This all culminated with me writing a demo project where I tied all the ideas together. It was pretty messy, but for the first time in a while I understood much of what I needed for the project and was able to tell what worked and what didn't. The thing was, this all took about a year. I was doing this alongside being a full-time student, remember, and it was around this time I had finished my second year at university. At this point, I had the option to do a year in industry placement, so rather than immediately starting my final year, I found a place with a company. This whole experience was very helpful for the project, as at this time I was beginning to reach a point where I felt like I generally had what I needed to start approaching writing the actual thing. It is now December of 2018 and a new day is breaking on my project. No more tech demos or throwaway snippets that never saw the light of day. Everything up until this point had been an investigation, but now I was preparing to write code that would actually be included in the finished game. I decided to name it the AV engine, short for audio video. The name was short and concise, meaning I could use it in places like C++ namespaces. The engine would be fully open source under the permissive MIT license, and my game would just be based on it. So really, what I was going to be working on for the next year was not a game, but a game engine. I knew all the bits that needed to go into it as I had written a prototype. I just needed to get started. This was one of the periods of the project where I had the most energy. I was absolutely raring to go and began development as the new year rolled in. I was going to make good decisions from the start, including good documentation and a heavy focus on automated testing. Games themselves would be written in Squirrel and my C++ would do the engine stuff underneath. I got off to a start writing the basics like cameras, simple mesh drawing interfaces, and engine setup and shutdown. I wrote the automated testing framework early on, which turned out to be one of the best decisions I made. I was able to write scripts to test my C++ and script API at the same time. In the early days, when my work on the engine wasn't writing games but features, this was invaluable. I followed a test-driven development approach where I would write a test in Squirrel, then complete the feature. This meant my API was tested in a repeatable manner, and checking for regressions became easy, as all I had to do was run the tests. Before long, I had my level chunk system, followed by my entity system. I then integrated bullet physics into the engine, doing this in a threaded way. It was another good learning experience, and my automated testing was invaluable here, as I started writing stress tests to find race conditions and memory leaks. From physics, I moved to terrain, for which I used Ogre's Terra sample. Previously, I had written my own, but Terra provided a ton of cool features and was written by the Ogre devs, so why not use it? Approaching final year university, I needed to start thinking of an idea for a final year project. I had wondered if, maybe, if I asked nicely, I would be able to work on something related to this project. The idea was to create something that was separate from the engine, something that I needed, but did not have. A level editor. Rockpool was dead, but not forgotten, and it had found a new purpose in guiding me towards the creation of its successor. I decided to name it Southsea, after the place I was living at the time. I made a number of improvements to this. I switched from WX widgets to MGUI, or MGUI, created a more coherent design for the code, including undo and redo actions from inception, and used Ogre Next from the get-go. A solid understanding of what I actually needed for the tool made this a way stable project, and I pretty much fixed all the issues I had with Rockpool in the development time. By the end of the 6-month period, I had a project with over 500 commits that had terrain editing, chunk switching, a fully editable scene hierarchy, resource selecting, object attribute editing, and to top it all off, full support for undo and redo. I'd just like to stress how big of a deal that final bit is. Undo and redo on all operations was an absolute nightmare and lasted for weeks and weeks. I felt like in later life I would be using Southsea pretty much full time while I made content for the game, so I wanted it to actually be nice to use. I probably went a bit far with some of it, but as it was my final year project, I sort of had that as an excuse. At one point, Southsea almost overtook the engine in number of commits. It was not done by this point, but I didn't think it would ever be properly done until I shipped my game. However, it was complete enough that all the features I wanted for the project were there, and I was happy to move back to engine work. I spent the next few months implementing a dialogue system that I had prototyped previously. I wanted to try and rewrite one of my older games using this engine, and I needed a dialogue system for that. However, I quickly found myself approaching 2020, the start of the new decade and an era of hope. Instead, I got ill from some curry and spent the start of the decade in bed playing on my Nintendo Switch. I wonder if that was a sign of things to come. No, the koalas! Yeah, turns out if you're a programmer you're not really that affected by a lockdown. While it was obviously a difficult time for lots of people, staying indoors was not that big of a deal for me as I was mostly doing that anyway. I did used to go to the gym every other day though and did miss doing that. In this time, I turned my focus to my project more than I ever had, being able to religiously crack on with work. Lectures were online, but I was busy implementing controller support in my engine. Although, there was one thing that made the lockdown stand out for me. Our neighbours had a cat who used to hang around in our place. We used to let her in to pet her and then named her Sauron as we didn't know her name. Our neighbours were fine with this, by the way. Anyway, at one point she started getting fat, so we just assumed this was what they did going into the winter. Maybe you already know where this is going. One morning, she was sleeping on my bed, and the next thing you know, she produced this litter of kittens. On my bed. As me and my uni friends had to stay inside, we asked our neighbours if we could look after them while they grew up, and they were like, okay. It's surprisingly hard to come up with names for animals, but we named them Fred, George and Luna. So the lockdown for me was really quite bizarre. We just had this box of adorable kittens to look after the whole time while we tried to work from home. Over these next few months, I finished my dialogue system, added proper controller and input support, terrain physics, ported to Ogre 2.2, and started investigating a GUI library called Calibri. This library is actually written by the main dev for Ogre Next, meaning it runs quite well. Being featureful enough while also simpler than some of the more mature libraries, I decided to go with this for GUI, as I knew I'd be able to contribute things as I needed them. I actually did this by writing the slider widget, which got merged as one of my first pull requests. I quite enjoyed contributing to this project, including porting it to Metal for Ogre, and writing some code to allow widgets to be rearranged during runtime. With my final exams shifted to open book exams by the Panicked University, I had to spend a few months away from the project. I was only really interested in this project, and it was a nightmare to pull myself away and work on my dissertation and exams. Eventually though, in what was the most unceremonious event of my life, I finished university with my final exam done. 4 years of struggle, and a pile of cash later, I was now a graduate. I got a 2-1, only a few percentage points away from a first. But the world was still in lockdown, and I wasn't really sure what to do with myself. The cats had now grown to be able to run around the place and were generally full of life, but they presented a problem. They were at that point in their lives where they were cute and playful. When kittens get rehomed, it tends to be around this age. This whole process really stressed me out, to be honest, as finding reliable homes for them is difficult. My parents eventually agreed to take one of them into their homes alongside our other cat, until I eventually had my own house for them to live in. Also, our neighbours had a friend who adopted Luna. However, we didn't have a home for a third cat. I eventually decided to take Fred, but something about the thought of George having to be offered up to the unknown stressed me out. I think I felt a bit guilty as I'd chosen his brother over him. We eventually had to take George as well, originally expecting that we'd find him a home later on, but we ultimately ended up keeping him. While I got the cats settled in, I eventually decided I would need to get a job and went back to my placement company as they'd already offered me a role. In the meantime, I tried to get development of the engine going as much as possible, as I had about a month before I started work. In this time, I implemented collision triggers using Bullet, something that had been missing from the engine for a while. However, I was now working full-time remotely as a software engineer. Trying to balance my time, I worked pretty ridiculously up until the end of 2020. Following on from my previous success trying to write simple games with the engine, I decided that as much of what was needed was now in place, I could improve my engine by trying to write a game with it. It was around this time I came across a game called A Short Hike, a lovely little game about a bird person trying to reach the top of a mountain to get phone signal. I had stumbled upon a video of the game's creator giving a talk about it. What I found most interesting about the game was its crunchy pixel aesthetic. It looked surprisingly good, and from this, I had an idea. I could make a game that was technically everything I had been working towards, but artistically simple, while also, probably, producing something fun. The thing was, my engine was pretty much there. After 2 long years and an entire level editor later, pretty much all of the basic features I had tested in the demo were ready to go. I played A Short Hike, and it was fun, and I was pretty inspired to make my own crunchy pixel DS looking game. Full of energy to make this game, progress was swift. I quickly identified lots of problems and features of the engine that it needed not to suck. These included the ability to place bits of data in the world to spawn entities, proper compositor support for Ogre, and improvements to my streamable world. Gradually, I had a game that seemed to fit my needs, and South Sea was really useful in creating this world. Ending 2020, I had had a very productive year, and was keen to see that flow into the next year. I was often tired, like after doing a hard day's work, but I was still able to work without trouble. 2021 was where this started to change, however. Now, you should understand what my lifestyle was like at this point. I would do my 9 to 5 at actual work while sat at my desk, then when that was done, swap in my personal laptop at my USB-C setup and start work on my project again. I'll also reiterate that I was living with my parents for this entire time. I was pretty much sat at a desk for an entire year. I was not doing fitness like I used to, and I had sort of ruined my social lifestyle as a result of COVID for most of this project. The problem was, I had to see the project progress, because I had decided it was my reason to be at this point. Working on something like this for so many years, at that point it's no longer a hobby but a lifestyle. If I took a day off the project, I would be consumed by this sinking feeling that I was wasting my time. I realised that time was moving on way faster than I expected, and everything was becoming a blur. I was struggling to fit the project in amongst my commitments at work, as well as my decreasing ability to sit at a desk and focus. Around this time, I really began to experience what you can probably expect. Burnout. A dreaded word in any creative endeavour. I began to feel as if the project was in a complete mess. I struggled to describe what I was actually working on to people, as it all seemed so abstract. I had an engine, but not a game, or at least the game I was working on to test the engine seemed to change every few weeks. I did get lots done in 2021, but many of these things were generic engine stuff, not major features. By the time 2022 rolled around, the burnout was real. Life was a jumble of game dev and professional work, but I kept pushing myself, and things just kept getting worse for the state of the world. I was not confident in how things were looking. My ultimate goal was to start work full time on this project, but I was scared of recession and general end of world. Actually quitting my job and going for it was a commitment that seemed a world away. I originally wanted to leave at the start of 2022, but pushed it back because I just felt that I would need the money. The project was limping on, and I felt I might be able to just carry on as I was while working full time. I eventually decided to leave my parents' home midway through 2022. I moved to an apartment close to my work's office so I could get back to seeing people like before. I enjoyed the commute that I had previously disliked as a waste of time. I had started going back to the gym in 2021 and kept that up, going every other day as a means of retaining any sort of lifestyle that wasn't computers. Gradually, I did begin to feel better about the state of the project. I started work on small throwaway games, which were really just to entertain myself. It took a while, but I eventually got back to how I felt about the project before the pandemic. I realised that the love of the craft I had always had never died. It had just been put on hold while I battled on through. At the end of October 2022, I came to a decision. I handed in my notice at work to leave for the end of the year. I had decided that the time had come to finish what I had started. Hey, you may recognise my voice from the video you just watched. That's for good reason, of course. This is actually what I look like. I'm going to do a quick physical recording just to talk through my plan for this channel and any of the things I may have missed from the previous section. This is the first video on this channel, so please feel free to subscribe down below if you want. You can see I'm an actual YouTuber now. I have indeed spent the past 6 years working on this project. It may be hard to believe, I don't know, but it's true. I would like to reiterate that I'm now more enthusiastic than ever to actually continue this project and ultimately finish it. As mentioned in the previous video, my approach has previously been to make a load of smaller games and keep going with those. I think this has been pretty invaluable in actually progressing the engine as well as improving my abilities. I still have lots to learn. I think everyone always has lots to learn. There's always more to learn, but I'm aware of what those things are, and I've figured out that developing smaller games will allow me to do that. I think the advantage of this is that obviously it's fun to produce things. I can progress my engine in the meantime, and I can generally make fun and interesting things on YouTube. I did sort of and ah for quite a long time about when I was actually going to start this channel. I was quite aware, I think, for a long time that I was probably going to start a channel at some point to talk through the development of this project. I already have quite a few ideas for smaller projects. In fact, I've pretty much planned out the games I'm probably going to be developing over the next few years. Some of them are games that were mentioned in the video back then. The RPG game, you know, the DS looking one, I want to finish that. I'm definitely going to finish that, so that's on the list, but it's not the immediate one that I'm going to be working on straight away. The reason for that is that I think it's more of a complicated game, and in the kind of burnout phase that I mentioned previously, I started work on what was sort of like a mobile RPG type game, and I just sort of really loved it, and I think that was part of what helped me end the burnout phase. So I want to finish that, and I want to do that one soon. I think you saw it at the end of the last video. It's quite kind of complicated to see, but essentially I'll be making a video about it later on, but it's about sort of fighting enemies, kind of Pokemon style. You can collect stuff. I think one of the things I'd always wanted was to make a mobile game, but I was also a bit disheartened about the way that the mobile game ecosystem sort of worked. It was always a bit exploitative, I thought, and the games were never really as fun as they could have been because of that. So I was kind of thinking that I wanted to make something that would be fun to me, and hopefully it would be fun to other people. As much as possible, I'd like to do this stuff myself. I think generally it's for me, it's always been a good and sort of fulfilling learning experience to try and do stuff myself, because I can learn new skills and everything like that. I think what I'd like to mention is that I would like to have experience of actually shipping games and having people play them before I actually even start to really properly develop my final game. And I'm saying final game because I think it's quite a bit of an enigma at the moment, and I sort of want to keep it that way. I don't want to give too many details away about it because I think just because of the way that it's all going to fit together, I think it makes more sense if I just let you know what it is when it's actually about to begin development. So my plan is that essentially what I've done is I've designated the different games according to the different skills and different skill denominations that I'm going to need in order to actually have finished the final game. So the first game I plan to make is really just technically simple, voxel graphics and predominantly GUI stuff. I think I need to get better at that because I'll be able to design user interfaces, get the skills involved of actually producing content and whatever, and then actually have the experience of shipping it. Secondly, I think the plan is to finish the RPG game that I mentioned in the previous section. The problem with that was that it was never really finished. You probably see from before, technically there was tons of stuff there, but obviously for a game itself there's not too much to look at. The models were all just like, it's fine. This is kind of what I need for short term more than actual production game, so it doesn't look like a finished thing. So I really want to fix that and actually get it shipped. And finally, I think I want to work on something that actually has a focus on art. So it's not going to be crunchy pixels or voxel graphics or anything like that. I want to make something that actually looks good. I was considering something sort of short, maybe that looks a bit like the game Journey, if you remember that. As in, it's quite short, but it's quite condensed in what it actually has in it. Of course, there's going to be a lot for me to learn, and the plan is almost certainly going to change as time goes on. That's certainly what happened with the previous 6 years. I think one of the things that kind of struck me was just how long everything takes to do. It took me way longer than I thought it would to just get to the point I am at the moment. And again, I will add that I wasn't working full-time on any of this, and I think that has a lot to do with sort of how the project ends up in the end. Being able to just devote my time fully to these projects, I found that they progress way quicker and are way more coherent. A problem I was routinely running into with the RPG game was that I was just working on low-hanging fruit, because I sort of reached, or I was experiencing times in my life where it was like, well, I only really feel like working on this bit today, which had a lot to do with the fact that I was, again, working full-time and generally had a lot on my plate. So not having those sort of time limitations is when I'm able to write the best sort of code that I can, and in theory do the best sort of art and models or whatever that the game will kind of need me to do. So I think obviously you can probably understand the reason I might be considering making a YouTube channel. It has a lot to do with the fact that I want to drum up excitement for these games. I have been working on this for a long time, sort of out of the public eye, but really I kind of want to start bringing that into the consciousness of the general world. So this is sort of about building an audience, but as well as that, I do actually want to make things, and I enjoy making things, and I just really want to see people play my stuff. It's quite a nice experience I found to it. I've actually made something and see it sort of persist. I might be dead, but it'll still be there. That's the sort of thing. That's what you do it for, isn't it? And I think so far I haven't really reached that point yet. I still haven't made the masterpiece that I thought I would have made by now. Again, 10 years time is a long time to develop games, but I'm more than halfway through it, and I'm 25 now, so I'm not young. Well, I am young, but I'm not as young as I used to be. So the question of how I actually run this channel, I don't think I've really decided that yet. It really depends. It depends on a few factors. I think predominantly it depends on when I actually have content to show. The thing is, I don't think I want to be one of these like one video a month, generally high quality editing type places, but I also don't want to be just fast food content that seems to come out every week or so. I think I'll probably be aiming for maybe 2, 3 maybe videos a month, and they're just going to be talking through the development of the game more than anything. One of the things that I'm going to be uploading in the next few weeks is a full technical dissection of where the engine actually is at the moment. A lot of the technical details had to be missed out on the previous section just because of the nature of what it was. really I'm looking to just make it more clear what the project is. One of the topics that was not mentioned in the previous video that I'd just like to touch on now is that in the next few months I'm about to be going off to do a year abroad in Japan. A lot of this dated back to prior to this project actually started. One of the strange sort of things I was doing in my free time was I tried to teach myself the Japanese writing system, sort of just for fun. But I later went on to university and they actually had an option where you could do a completely free language course as just, like extra credit module. So I ended up doing a Japanese course full time and really enjoyed it actually. I think I learned quite a bit from doing it, and I think it's just nice to learn another language. And I got quite far into it, and I sort of came up with this plan that come end of university I would go off and try and become actually fluent, because I don't know, I wanted to be a polyglot, but of course you can maybe understand why that didn't happen. Of course I graduated in 2020, so everything sort of didn't really fit together. So really I ended up putting it off for a while, but I think I've kind of come to the conclusion that if I don't do this now, then it will never happen. I spent a lot of time contemplating when to actually start this channel, and one of the main considerations was that this year in abroad is maybe gonna interrupt that a little bit. But the conclusion I came to was just that I think I need to get started with this. I just put it off for too long. I think it's something that I had always wanted to do, and I was aware that, again, time is moving on. I think at some point I would like to have a wife and children or something like that, but I realised that this window of time between now and when I would actually be considered able to do this thing is rapidly shrinking. So I just decided I would do it, and I'm going to keep making videos in the meantime. I do have about 3 months roughly before I leave, so I'm looking to just kind of smash this project as much as I can and see what I can get done in the meantime. Maybe videos will decrease when I'm abroad, but we'll have to see. I think I'm going to try my best to fit it in, and if not, I'm sure I can just make something or other. I mean, I would be in the internet's favourite country, so taking content might not be too difficult. But fundamentally this is a game dev channel, so my plan is to progress the game as much as possible, and I want to have those regular devlogs because I do want to see the game progress. One thing I would like to reiterate just before I leave is that I will be dead in a ditch before this project is left unfinished. I think that's my idea about the whole thing. I don't care how many tears have to be shed, or how much blood, or how many bloody tears have to be shed. I will see it done. I swear to God I will see it done. You don't work on something for 6 years and then just throw it away, is how I feel about this. And I think it's really been a lifelong endeavour for me ultimately. I felt like this is kind of what I was progressing up to. This is, I do believe it's the thing that defines my life. I think all that's left to say now is please subscribe. I will be posting videos regularly, and I'm looking forward to cracking on with this project as I always have done. So see you in the next video.